Number 11. Drunk beautician tries to seduce cops. In 2023, deputies in Monroe County, Florida, attempted to pull over a Cadillac CXT that had been seen driving on the wrong side of the road for 5 miles. Later identified by her first name, Heather, the driver led law enforcement on a high-speed chase before finally stopping. As she exited the vehicle, police noticed that she was stumbling and exhibiting other signs of intoxication, leading them to believe she was under the influence. Heather initially denied driving drunk, instead claiming that she was in a distressed mental state after arguing with a family member. She eventually admitted to having 3 drinks that day and agreed to undergo a field sobriety test, which she performed poorly on. In addition to being unsteady on her feet, she failed to follow basic instructions. When the deputy administering the test told Heather to touch his finger, she allegedly gave him a military salute, and during the walk and turn test, she posed like a ballerina. After realizing that she wasn't effectively faking her way through the test, police say Heather tried to seduce her way out of trouble by offering to do anything a deputy wanted her to do. He didn't take her up on the offer and instead arrested her on suspicion of driving while intoxicated. The suspect's behavior reportedly continued to devolve after arriving at the police station, where she cried and slurred her words. She was also accused of trying to yield false breathalyzer results by not blowing into the machine properly. Her blood alcohol content tested at roughly twice the legal limit, and she was ultimately convicted and sentenced to a year of probation, along with 60 hours of community service. Number 10. Operation Edsel. On July 15, 1992, a model and young mother named Rachel Nichol was brutally murdered during a morning walk on Wimbledon Common in southwest London. The killer stabbed her nearly 50 times in the crazed attack, and the police immediately fell under immense pressure to identify and capture the culprit. Investigators were quick to narrow their suspicions on a loner named Colin Stagg, who frequently walked his dog in the area. There was no forensic evidence linking him to the crime, but police became increasingly convinced that he was the killer. In an attempt to nail Stagg for the crime, law enforcement embarked on a so-called covert mission called Operation Edsel. Acting under the belief that Stagg would confess to the murder to an intimate partner, the leaders of the investigation tasked a female undercover officer with feigning a romantic interest in the suspect. Stagg fell for the undercover cop, known only by her code name Lizzie James, and opened up about fantasies that a criminal psychologist later interpreted as violent, but he never admitted to having any involvement in Rachel's death. In fact, he repeatedly told the undercover cop that he didn't kill Rachel during her various attempts to get him to confess to the crime. He was nevertheless prosecuted for the crime, but the case fell apart in court after the judge refused to allow unreliable evidence from Operation Edsel to be presented at trial. In addition to putting an innocent man's freedom on the line over baseless allegations, the botched investigation distracted law enforcement from pursuing more meaningful leads. The case went cold for many years until 2007, when authorities charged a convicted killer named Robert Napper with Rachel's murder. He was convicted of a reduced manslaughter charge on the grounds of diminished responsibility due to severe mental issues and was committed to a mental hospital. It's unlikely that he'll ever be released. Following the collapse of Stagg's trial, Lizzie James left the police force and sued for emotional damages, claiming that she suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of her assigned role in the bungled investigation. She moved away with her husband, who was also a police officer, and took on a new identity, which she's still living under today. According to the Daily Mail, the couple are respected members of their community, and nobody knows of their involvement in the case. Their new identities are sealed from the public record, ensuring that their past will never come back to haunt them. Stagg was less fortunate. He didn't receive any protection from the government or an opportunity to start over, and he didn't even get a direct apology from law enforcement, who expressed their remorse to the media but failed to reach out to him personally. Number 9. Derek Aldridge. Nobody knows exactly when Derek Aldridge began swindling unsuspecting middle-aged women out of all their money, and the true extent of his crimes will likely never be known. By the time he made national headlines in early 2018, it was believed that he'd scammed at least 27 victims out of millions of dollars throughout the United States, and apparently he targeted his victims through dating websites like Match and Our Time. Aldridge created numerous fictitious identities as part of his years-long scheme. He always assumed a highly successful persona, posing as a lawyer, investment banker, businessman, doctor, firefighter, or Navy pilot. In reality, though, he was none of those things. He was even living at a homeless shelter in Minneapolis when he met one of his victims, who believed her new boyfriend was simply a kind-hearted college professor who volunteered there in his spare time as a way to give back to the community. But unfortunately, she quickly learned the hard way that the only thing Aldridge knew how to do was take. In addition to stealing actual money, credit cards, and valuables from the women he dated, Aldridge stole their social security cards and other identifying documents, enabling him to access their financial accounts and open new accounts in their names and without their knowledge. He drained their life savings and retirement funds, then vanished from their lives, leaving them destitute and on their own to pick up the pieces. From the outside looking in, it's hard to understand how so many people fell for Aldridge's scams, especially because he targeted intelligent and successful women in their 40s and 50s who didn't fit the stereotypical profile of a naive damsel in distress who needed rescuing. But everyone has weaknesses, and Aldridge knew how to spot women who were going through tough times in their lives and swooped in like a knight in shining armor. In many cases, victims were fresh out of a rough breakup or divorce, making them particularly vulnerable to the temptation of having a shoulder to lean on. Like most other bad people, it was only a matter of time before Aldridge was held accountable for his wrongdoings. Many of his victims were determined not to let him get away with his crimes, and the women eventually began to find each other online. They formed an alliance and did everything in their power to ensure that justice was served, not only for the sake of righting past wrongs, but to stop Aldridge from continuing to siphon money from innocent women. Authorities also began to pay attention to the allegations against Aldridge, and in 2016 the serial scammer was arrested on multiple federal charges in connection with his crimes against 9 women. He was convicted of 1 count of mail fraud and 2 counts of aggravated identity fraud, and is currently serving a more than 2 decades-long federal prison sentence. Records show that he'll be released in 2036 at the age of 65, which unfortunately presents the very real possibility that he'll continue to scam women after he regains his freedom. Number 8. Tess Dom and Brian Grove. Teenage sweethearts Tess Dom and Brian Grove met in 2006 while attending the same high school in Lafayette, Colorado. They both saw themselves as outcasts and bonded over their perceived inability to fit in with the mainstream crowd. In many ways, Tess and Brian seemed like typical love-struck adolescents, but as their relationship grew, the troubled pair began to wear their antisocial tendencies like badges of honor, almost as if they were proud of their dysfunction. And while it quickly became clear that the couple fed off each other's energy in an intense and ominous way, nobody in their lives predicted just how deadly the consequences would be, even though the signs were there. It's normal for teens to rebel, but Tess and Brian's behavior contained red flags indicating that a far more sinister force was at play than typical youthful defiance. Brian had a history of making extremely violent threats against people, and his blog posts were plagued by overtones of anger, bitterness, and despair. The main problem in Tess's life was her difficult relationship with her mother, 52-year-old Linda Dom, who was a good parent when she was sober. But she suffered from alcohol addiction, and she was allegedly abusive when she drank. Tensions between mother and daughter began inching toward their boiling point after Linda lost her job. And in addition to being home all the time, her drinking worsened, causing Tess to become increasingly resentful toward her. At some point, Brian and Tess began to seriously entertain the idea of murdering Linda. Their plan came to fruition in February 2007, when Brian stabbed his girlfriend's mother to death in a frenzied knife attack. After 2 failed attempts at burying Linda's body, they put her corpse into the trunk of her car and left it there with no apparent plans to get rid of it. Police discovered Linda's body 3 weeks later after receiving an anonymous tip, and it wasn't long before Tess and Brian were arrested in connection with the case. They gave conflicting stories during questioning, leaving it unclear as to who was more culpable for the crime. According to one version of events, it was Brian's idea to kill Linda, but prosecutors would later accuse Tess of telling Brian to murder her mother. Others speculated that the situation was less black and white, and that Brian was compelled to eliminate Linda from the picture by any means necessary because he was so enamored with Tess that he was essentially under her spell. Tess had a reputation for using her feminine wiles to her advantage, and Brian seemed infatuated almost to the point of obsession. Brian Grove ultimately pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. He'll be 41 years old when he becomes eligible for parole in 2031. Tess pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and solicitation of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 23 years behind bars. She was paroled in 2018 after serving nearly 10 years and has remained out of the public eye since her release. Number 7. Elizabeth Zender Turpin. 22-year-old Michael Turpin vanished in February 1986 during his 4th year as an accounting student at the University of Kentucky. He was reported missing by his wife, Elizabeth Zender Turpin, who told police that she'd arrived at the couple's home in Lexington after spending the night at a friend's to find the apartment empty and the walls covered with blood. Several days later, Michael's body was found in a pond at a local golf course, and sadly he'd been stabbed 19 times in the face and throat. Michael's murder came just months after he and Elizabeth married, and shortly before he was due to graduate with his bachelor's degree. Up until that point, it seemed as though his life was going extremely well. But things weren't as perfect behind closed doors as they seemed on the surface. According to people who knew the couple at the time, Michael wanted to settle down while Elizabeth seemed intent on maintaining a lifestyle that revolved around partying and socializing. Their conflicting priorities caused problems in the marriage, and Michael reportedly struggled to keep up with the costs of his wife's recreational activities. Elizabeth hardly seemed like a grieving widow at her husband's funeral, where she was seen laughing with guests like it was an ordinary day. But by then, investigators were already suspicious of the young woman, who had seemed like she was going out of her way to give police a credible alibi, even before Michael's body was found. While explaining to police that she had slept at a co-worker's apartment on the night of Michael's disappearance, Elizabeth went into great detail about how she didn't drive home due to inclement weather, her poor eyesight, and because she'd been drinking. These are all good reasons to avoid driving, but detectives sensed that she was oversharing for a reason. Elizabeth also told investigators that her husband was deeply involved in organized crime and that he even had a street name, Shark. However, if Michael really was a big deal on the street as she claimed, law enforcement would have most likely known about his involvement in the criminal underworld. But they never found any evidence that he was leading a nefarious lifestyle that would have put him at risk of gang violence. Further investigation revealed that Elizabeth was having an affair with her co-worker, Karen Brown, in the months leading up to Michael's murder. She was also the sole beneficiary of her husband's $60,000 life insurance policy. A break in the case finally came when Karen Brown cracked under pressure during questioning. She gave a detailed confession implicating Elizabeth as the mastermind behind the murder and their colleague Keith Bouchard as the actual killer. Karen admitted to being the getaway driver and recruiting Bouchard to commit the murder at Elizabeth's urging. Bouchard agreed to kill Michael in exchange for several $1,000s from the life insurance payout Elizabeth expected to receive. The plan was put in motion one evening after Elizabeth noticed that her car had been moved to a different parking spot outside of a bar where she, Brown, and Bouchard were drinking. Michael was the only other person with a key to the vehicle, and she became enraged when she made the discovery. Karen also became upset, and the women decided that Michael's murder couldn't wait any longer. Having persuaded her co-workers to do her dirty work for her, Elizabeth waited at Karen's apartment while Karen drove Keith to and from the murder scene. Keith Bouchard testified against both women, who were tried together in exchange for a life sentence without parole. A jury found Elizabeth Turpin and Karen Brown guilty of capital murder, and they were each sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 25 years. They've both served their 25-year minimum, but remain behind bars for the time being. Number 6. Joe Morrissey. Former Virginia State Senator Joe Morrissey has worn many hats throughout his adult life. He's a career politician, first and foremost, and a former lawyer who was disbarred twice over allegations of corruption and misconduct. Morrissey, who calls himself Fightin' Joe, has been arrested and sued many times, including for allegedly hitting a former client in his office back in 2018. Many of these cases, both civil and criminal, have been dismissed, but Fightin' Joe always seems to be involved in scandals, more often than not. His professional life is chaotic, but his personal life is just as messy and perhaps even more shocking. Morrissey has 8 children with 5 different women. 3 of them were born to his former secretary, whom he pursued an inappropriate relationship with when she was interning for him as a teenager. At the time, Morrissey was in his mid-50s. In 2013, police caught the pair in a compromising situation at Morrissey's home. He was indicted on charges relating to his illicit deeds the following year. Morrissey denied the allegations, claiming that the young woman had come to his home seeking advice about some family problems. He initially accused the prosecutor of having a vendetta against him, but ultimately took a plea deal, which came with a 6-month jail sentence that was later reduced to just 90 days. He resigned from his post, but was re-elected after serving his time. By then, the young woman in the case, Myrna Pride, had gotten pregnant with Morrissey's child. According to court documents, Morrissey allegedly asked the 18-year-old if she could pretend that one of her male friends was the baby's father. However, he finally acknowledged that he was the true father in mid-2015, after months of remaining silent on the issue. Morrissey and Pride married in 2016 and went on to have 2 more children. On the surface, they appeared to portray a happy all-American family, but things were reportedly much different behind closed doors. Myrna, who now goes by the last name Warren, filed for divorce in 2023. By then, she and Morrissey had separated, and Myrna had a new boyfriend. The former couple had become entangled in an acrimonious and highly publicized war over which of them was the real culprit in their problems. In the divorce filing, Myrna accused Morrissey of being an abusive serial cheater who paraded her around like a trophy but treated her badly in private. Shortly after news of the impending split broke, the then 27-year-old told the Washington Post that she interned at Morrissey's office as a teen because she dreamed of becoming a lawyer, but her relationship with the much older politician and other obstacles forced her to take a detour from her career plans and play the part of a dutiful politician's wife. She obediently put her entire life on hold to be at her husband's side at his campaign events and public appearances. There have been no updates on the divorce case since 2023, but one can only hope that Myrna has finally managed to disentangle from Morrissey and is enjoying the new chapter in her life. Number 5. Dedra Hunt and Costa Photopoulos. Dedra Hunt was barely an adult when she fled New England for Daytona Beach in the mid-1980s for a fresh start. Shortly after arriving in Florida, she caught the attention of 30-year-old Konstantinos Costa Photopoulos, a married pool hall owner who operated a counterfeit money scam while hiding behind the face of his legitimate establishment. The seedy businessman offered Dedra an opportunity to make some quick and easy cash by participating in his counterfeiting operation, which involved paying for small purchases with fake $100 bills and turning the change over to Costa in exchange for a cut of the ill-gotten proceeds. After moving to the US from Greece to attend college during his younger years, Costa married Lisa Papadakis, whose family owned a popular amusement center along the Daytona Beach boardwalk. Lisa wasn't crazy about Costa's proposal to open a pool hall, believing that it would attract a seedy crowd, but she reluctantly supported her husband's ambitions. All she expected in return was for Costa to be a loyal husband, a good father, and a decent member of society. On the surface, Costa lived up to these expectations, but in reality, he went out of his way to hide his degenerate lifestyle from his wife. He became bored with his marriage and developed a wandering eye, but was happy to reap the benefits of Lisa's wealth and therefore had no plans to leave her. So it's not exactly surprising that Costa began a torrid affair with Dedra shortly after the young woman began working for him. Lisa noticed Dedra's constant presence at the pool hall and her husband's growing absence from their home. Costa denied that anything was going on between him and Dedra, and for the time being, Lisa took his explanation at face value. In the meantime, federal authorities became suspicious of Costa's financial activities, causing the counterfeiting scheme to fall apart. And because the pool hall was more of a shady hangout than a profitable business, Costa became increasingly dependent on Lisa for money. By then, Dedra had grown viciously jealous of Lisa's wealth and had started pressuring Costa to provide her with a similar lifestyle. Around the same time, Lisa discovered the affair and threatened to divorce Costa. And his problems only worsened when a former accomplice in the counterfeiting operation named Kevin Ramsey began demanding hush money in exchange for his silence. Motivated purely by greed, Costa and Dedra hatched a plan to eliminate Lisa from the picture and get their hands on her money. But their first order of business was to get rid of Kevin Ramsey. On October 20th, 1989, the couple lured the young man on a drive to a remote wooded area where they said they were going to initiate him into a secret club. Instead, though, they tied Ramsey to a tree and filmed themselves shooting him to death. After killing Ramsey, Costa ordered Dedra to find a hitman to murder Lisa. She approached a recent transplant from Ohio named Brian Chase, who she knew was infatuated with her and would do almost anything to please her. The impressionable 18-year-old agreed to kill Lisa for a cut of her $700,000 life insurance policy. 15 days after Ramsey's murder, Chase entered the Photopoulos' home in the middle of the night and shot Lisa in the head while Costa lay next to her, pretending to sleep. Immediately after Chase fired the bullet, Costa sprang out of bed and gunned him down with an AK-47, which had been part of the plan all along in order to eliminate the teen as a witness. Lisa was unconscious but alive when emergency responders arrived at the home. As paramedics rushed her to the hospital, Costa spoke with police thinking they'd believe that he was an innocent victim who had heroically come to his wife's defense against a home intruder. He was likely shocked when Lisa survived her injuries and remembered enough of what had happened to implicate her husband in the crime, and during a subsequent search of the home, detectives found a videotape of Ramsey's murder. Costa and Dedra were both convicted of murdering Ramsey and Chase, and were sentenced to death. Dedra's term was eventually commuted to life without parole, and Costa remains on death row to this day. It's unclear whether an execution date has been set, and while Lisa's assailants have spent the last several decades languishing behind bars, knowing they'll never see freedom again, she went on to make a full recovery and eventually remarried. Number 4. Benjamin Field. While recovering from an illness in the hospital in early 2017, an 83-year-old British woman named Anne Moore Martin told her niece that she was involved in an intimate relationship with a man in his mid-20s named Benjamin Field. Suspecting that Field was taking advantage of her lonely old aunt, the niece contacted law enforcement. Investigators soon discovered that Field had befriended Anne and duped her into making him the beneficiary of her will by manipulating and drugging her. The senior citizen had also given her much younger lover more than £30,000 to buy himself a new car and a dialysis machine for his sick younger brother. As part of his efforts to manipulate Anne, Field had written messages from God on the mirrors throughout her home. Thankfully, though, the fraud was detected in time for Anne to take Field out of her will before she died from natural causes a few months later. During the investigation, detectives took a closer look at the death of Anne's neighbor, 69-year-old Peter Farquhar, who'd passed away in his home in Maids Morton, Buckinghamshire, 2 years earlier. They discovered that Field had also seduced Farquhar in a bid to convince the elderly gentleman to bequeath £20,000 to him. When Farquhar was found dead in his home in October 2015, investigators initially concluded that he'd succumbed to alcohol poisoning. However, when they revisited the case, they realized that he'd been poisoned and strangled to death. Authorities charged Field in connection with Farquhar's murder and for defrauding Anne Moore Martin. In court, prosecutors accused the defendant of lacing Farquhar's food with drugs and spiking his drinks with extremely strong alcohol as part of a gaslighting scheme to convince the senior citizen that he was losing his mind. Field pleaded guilty to multiple fraud and burglary counts in connection with the deceptive relationships, and he was found guilty of murdering Farquhar. He was then sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 36 years. Number 3. Mike and Leslie Mul. In September 2003, 911 dispatchers in Little Rock, Arkansas, received an emergency call from a friend of 58-year-old Janie Ballard, who'd stopped at the recently widowed woman's home to check on her after failing to reach her by phone. Less than a month after losing her husband Lester to a lengthy illness, Janie had been stabbed at least 70 times in an attack that was so brutal her head was nearly severed. At first glance, the home appeared ransacked, making the murder seem like the possible result of a home invasion gone wrong. But Janie's killer had clearly murdered her in a fit of rage, indicating that the crime was personal and that the victim knew her murderer. Investigators were quick to narrow their focus on Janie's daughter, 27-year-old Leslie Mul, who'd become estranged from her family in recent years after marrying her husband, Mike. Leslie had always been described by those who knew her during her younger years as a good girl, but she'd changed dramatically after falling under Mike's spell. Leslie and Mike met at a gym in 2000, 3 years before Janie's murder. Infatuated by her big-muscled beau, who was 23 years her senior, Leslie forfeited her wholesome image and transformed into Mike's living Barbie doll, complete with breast augmentation, bleach blonde hair, and heavy makeup. Her parents didn't like the changes, and they blamed Mike for influencing their daughter. They refused to support the relationship and were tremendously disappointed when Leslie married Mike. The strained relationships between the couple and Leslie's parents were enough to make the Muls persons of interest in Janie's murder. Leslie's over-the-top reaction to the news of her mother's death only heightened detectives' suspicions that she was somehow involved. Further investigation revealed that Leslie and Mike were struggling financially, and that the couple believed Leslie would inherit as much as $2 million if her parents died within 30 days of one another. But the couple was apparently unaware that Janie had recently amended her will, reducing Leslie's inheritance to just $25,000 and disinheriting her from the family business. These changes came following an argument between Janie and Leslie shortly after Lester Ballard's death, when Leslie stopped at her parents' house and noticed that her mother had redecorated. The self-proclaimed daddy's girl felt as though Janie had erased any remnant of her father's existence, and it sent her into a rage that left Janie fearing for her life. While being questioned by police after her mother's murder, Leslie claimed that her parents and husband got along. But investigators had already done their research and knew this was a lie, and they were confident that Leslie knew more about Janie's death than she was admitting to. She eventually cracked under pressure from interrogators and admitted to killing her mother. Leslie claimed that Mike helped her plan the crime, and they were both charged with capital murder. In court, her defense attorney depicted Mike Mul as a ruthless and violent con artist who intimidated and manipulated Leslie into killing Janie. Unswayed by the defense's claims, the court found Leslie guilty as charged and sentenced her to life without parole. Mike denied ever abusing Leslie or having any involvement in Janie's death, but he failed to prove his innocence in court. He was convicted of first-degree murder and theft of property and was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Number 2. Larry Mazza. 18-year-old Larry Mazza was working as a delivery boy in Brooklyn during the late 1970s when he first met 32-year-old mafia wife Linda Shiro, who was married to a high-ranking member of the Colombo family named Gregory Scarpa. The 18-year-old was instantly smitten by the attractive Italian-American woman, who was 14 years his senior. Most people would agree that getting involved with a mobster's wife is a really bad idea, but at the time Larry didn't realize Scarpa was in the mafia, and when Linda invited him over to her house to fool around one evening, he just couldn't say no. What began as a few glasses of wine quickly led to a steamy romp on the married woman's sofa, and the affair only intensified from there. After a while, Linda began pressuring Larry to meet her husband, who she said could help him find a job. Many years later, Larry would reveal during his Wide Awake Project podcast that he could tell something wasn't right about the situation, but he was interested in work opportunities, so he agreed to meet Scarpa, who he believed was a traveling salesman. As a native New Yorker, Larry knew how to spot a wise guy from a mile away. The moment he laid eyes on Scarpa during their first meeting, he suddenly understood what he'd gotten himself into. He started his criminal career as a debt collector for Scarpa and soon began to rise through the ranks of the organization, but he felt immensely guilty about the affair he was having with his new boss's wife. Deep down, Larry knew that his tryst with Linda was wrong. He was also scared that Scarpa would kill him if the affair was ever discovered, so he began to distance himself from both his boss and his mistress. But Scarpa wasn't willing to let go of his new employee that easily. After figuring out why Larry was avoiding him, Scarpa pulled the teen into his office and told him that he knew about the affair, and much to Larry's surprise, Scarpa said he was okay with it because Larry kept Linda company when he wasn't around. He allowed the affair to continue under one condition: if anyone else found out about it, Larry and that person would both be killed. In a weird way, the arrangement led to a closer bond between Larry and Scarpa, who developed a deepened trust after establishing their shared secrets. Larry went on to become one of the Colombo's family's most notorious murder masterminds, arranging as many as 25 hits and personally carrying out at least 4 of them. His mafia career came to an end during the early 90s after he fled to Florida during a law enforcement crackdown on organized crime in New York. He was eventually captured and arrested on charges that he could have faced a life sentence for, including racketeering and murder. Like many other mafiosos who get caught, Larry turned state's witness and testified against a corrupt FBI agent in exchange for a dramatically reduced federal prison sentence of 9 years. He served his time and now makes a living sharing his experiences as an author and podcaster. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear more bizarre and crazy stories, stay tuned after the video for some more content. Number 1. Tia Young and Harvey Timothy Lee. George Young was a hard-working family man who owned a successful security business. Both he and his wife, Tia Young, were respected members of their community in Beaufort, Georgia, where they had a reputation for never thinking twice when it came to helping out a friend. So when George ran into his childhood buddy, Harvey Timothy Lee, in 2015, learning that he'd fallen on hard times and was living out of hotels, it only seemed natural to offer him a job. George also invited Harvey to live with him and Tia rent-free until he got on his feet. Over time, Harvey's financial situation started to improve. He continued to live with the Youngs, but began paying rent as soon as he could afford to. Harvey was still living at the residence more than 2 years later in November 2017 when George was shot outside his house as he showed up home from work late one night. Emergency responders arrived to find him dead on his front porch with his keys still in the door. Harvey told investigators that he was on his laptop inside the residence when he heard gunshots, while Tia claimed that she awoke to the sound of the shots. When investigators questioned them about the nature of their relationship, they said that they were siblings. But it wasn't long before law enforcement discovered that they were having an affair under the very roof that George had provided them both. It's unclear when the illicit tryst began, but according to prosecutors, it went on long enough for Tia and Harvey to decide that they wanted to pursue a serious future together. Instead of doing what most people would do in that situation, divorce her husband, Tia allegedly conspired with her side lover to kill George so they could collect on his $1 million life insurance policy, and so Harvey could take over his security company. Both suspects denied any involvement in the crime, but they were nevertheless charged with his murder. Authorities believe that Harvey shot George, but under Georgia law, a defendant can be convicted of murder if they're found responsible for someone's death, even if they didn't necessarily pull the trigger. Consequently, Harvey and Tia were each charged with 1 count of felony murder and 1 count of malice murder, which is when a person kills their victim intentionally and without provocation. At trial, prosecutors accused Harvey of putting a tracking device on George's vehicle and researching spider and snake poison several weeks before the murder. They also presented evidence that Tia had filed to collect on George's life insurance on the day of his death, which is usually not a priority for most grieving spouses. A search of Tia's phone also turned up a meme featuring a joke about an affair and a husband's violent death. Describing the allegations against Tia and Harvey as a thin case, the couple's attorneys claimed that George Young lived a double life and had a secret gambling problem which may have caused him to make enemies with someone who wanted him dead. And while the forensic evidence against both parties was admittedly weak, the jury was unswayed by the defense's claims. Tia Young was found guilty of felony murder, aggravated assault, and attempting to tamper with evidence. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Harvey Lee was convicted of felony murder, malice murder, and aggravated assault. He's currently serving life without parole in the state prison system, where he'll never need to rely on a kind and unsuspecting soul to take him in ever again. Number 10. Bradley Robert Dawson. Newlywed Krista Chen was found beaten to death at an exclusive resort in Fiji just days after getting married in early 2022. The 36-year-old pharmacist met her husband, 38-year-old Bradley Robert Dawson, just 3 months earlier. They tied a knot after a whirlwind romance and went on their honeymoon at the upscale $3,500 per night Turtle Island Resort, where they stayed in a suite paid for by Chen's parents. The last night Krista was seen alive, witnesses recalled seeing the couple arguing and drinking heavily. Chen was allegedly angry with Dawson for flirting and dancing with other women at the resort. When they retired to their suite, the noise continued for some time before suddenly going silent. A butler found her badly beaten body the next day, slumped between the small space between the room's toilet and the wall. Dawson was found with a few minor injuries at a secluded beach on a neighboring island, where authorities believe he planned to catch a boat to mainland Fiji before fleeing the country. He insisted that Chen's death was an accident, but authorities didn't believe him. They charged Dawson with murder, and he remains behind bars in Fiji, awaiting the next step in his case. Chen's parents said that if he's not held criminally liable, they plan to file a civil lawsuit against him for their daughter's death. Number 9. Todd Chance. On August 25, 2013, the slain body of 45-year-old truck driver Todd Chance was found in an orchard in Bakersfield, California. Someone had shot him twice in the chest at point-blank range, leaving his 53-year-old wife, Leslie, a widow. Police found Todd's car abandoned and unlocked at an intersection roughly 20 miles, 32 kilometers from where his body was discovered. Inside the vehicle, they recovered a gun belonging to Todd and Leslie. It was starting to seem like the car was staged as part of an elaborate attempt to throw investigators off. Detectives learned that Leslie had attended a CSI convention in Las Vegas months before Todd's murder, leading them to believe that she used what she learned to plan the crime. She denied having any involvement in her husband's death, but police only discovered more reasons to suspect her, enough to charge her with first-degree murder. They found flirtatious text messages between Todd and his ex-fiancée from before he married Leslie, and wondered if Leslie had discovered the correspondence. The other woman testified in court that Todd had reached out to her, but Leslie's defense team argued that their client had no clue about the affair. Regardless of her motives, she faced a mountain of evidence against her. She was seen with Todd hours before he was killed and made numerous life insurance claims afterwards. The FBI disproved her alibi, and she got an even bigger reality check when a jury found her guilty of murder. After failing to pull off the perfect crime, Leslie was sentenced to life in prison. Number 8. Marty Malone. Stephen Verwoerd was a twice-divorced single dad who started over after moving to Bothell, Washington to work as a telecommunications supervisor during the 90s. He didn't know anyone in the area before moving there and had no known enemies to speak of, yet he was found murdered in his trailer home in 1997. During the investigation, detectives questioned Verwoerd's second ex-wife, Marty Malone, who was living in Tucson at the time. She showed an obvious attraction to one particularly handsome Bothell detective named Ed Hopkins. He cracked the case by convincing the smitten suspect that he was on her side and that he was capable of making anything bad she may have done go away. Malone told Hopkins that she had hired a man named Jonathan Curtis to murder Verwoerd so she could collect on his $150,000 life insurance policy that she happened to be the beneficiary of. She offered Hopkins a cut of the payout to kill Curtis and to make other evidence disappear. Little did she know, all of her conversations with the detective were recorded and under surveillance. When Malone met with Hopkins to discuss what she thought were the final details of the cover-up and their future plans together, they were swarmed by police. She was shocked to realize that she had fallen for what many would call the most obvious undercover plot imaginable. Curtis was convicted of first-degree murder and received a life sentence. Malone admitted to the murder-for-hire plot and was sentenced to 23 years behind bars in exchange for her testimony against Curtis. Number 7. Delaney, Brennan, and Jack Elliot. Jack Elliot was just 19 years old when he went boating with some friends in Travis Lake near Austin, Texas, and never returned. The college freshman and 11 others were drinking and wakeboarding near the famous Devil's Cove party area when Elliot suddenly tumbled off the boat and into the water. The young man's fling, Delaney Brennan, had playfully shoved him while the two were flirting, causing him to fall to his death, hitting the propeller along the way. It was nighttime by then, and nobody could see him in their pitch-dark surroundings. Terrified of getting in trouble with the law, the teens erupted into hysteria and then hatched a cover-up story to give to the police about Jack's disappearance. They dumped all of their booze off the boat and agreed to feign ignorance about their friend's death. Their different versions of the story didn't match up, leaving detectives and Jack's family wondering what really happened that night. Jack's remains were found 10 days after he went missing, but it didn't bring the answers that his loved ones and law enforcement were hoping for. One witness, Carly Martin, grew so tired of the lies that she traveled to Jack's parents' home in California to tell them the truth. Several others eventually admitted that Delaney had pushed Jack, although she never meant for him to land in the water and drown. In late 2021, more than 2 years after Jack's death, a grand jury indicted several of the teens who participated in the cover-up on various charges. Delaney Brennan faces a felony charge of tampering with evidence by aiding in the deletion of a cell phone video. If convicted, she could be sentenced up to 10 years behind bars and hit with a $10,000 fine. 5 others were charged with different crimes for their role in the incident, including serving alcohol to minors, tampering with evidence, perjury, and giving false information to a police officer. Number 6. Joseph Traviso. Joseph Traviso was a high-functioning 30-year-old man with special needs, but due to his mental restrictions, he had the mind of a 15-year-old boy. To gain some life skills, he began working at a thrift store in Mesa, Arizona, owned by a charity called Community Provider Enrichment Services. However, instead of leading Traviso toward a better life, the job brought him to his death. In May 2018, his supervisor, Jesse Dakins, viciously stabbed him to death for allegedly flirting with his girlfriend. Traviso's mother, Rachel Perez, told the East Valley Tribune that her son saw Dakins as a friend and someone who accepted him as a normal person. According to court documents, Dakins and his girlfriend, Tiffany Warren, regularly persuaded Traviso to use methamphetamine with them. Shortly before he was murdered, the couple got high for several weeks straight, and at some point, Dakins became jealous of Warren's close friendship with the victim. Suspicious that the two were having an affair, Dakins stabbed Traviso at least 27 times. Dakins and Warren then dumped the victim's body in the woods about 90 minutes away and attempted to clean up the murder scene. They confessed when confronted by police. Warren was found guilty of first-degree hindering prosecution, and Dakins was convicted of second-degree murder and manslaughter. He was sentenced to life in prison. In a civil suit, Traviso's mother accused the company her son and his killer worked for of turning a blind eye to the alleged abuse that led up to her son's death. The lawsuit also claims that Warren and Dakins persuaded Joseph to use drugs with them, buy them drugs, and help them pay their rent. Other staff members allegedly knew of Dakins' shady behavior, but did nothing about it. Perez said that she wanted to see justice for her son and changes to protect vulnerable populations from being victimized like Traviso was. Number 5. Wade Edward Smith and James Preston Allen Vaughn. Buddies Wade Edward Smith and James Preston Allen Vaughn were regular customers at a gas station in Melville, Louisiana, where they regularly flirted with a young woman who worked there. Concerned that the flirting would cause problems between the men and her boyfriend, 18-year-old Jaden Michael Ardoin, the woman asked Vaughn and Smith to dial down the charm, and they agreed. Ardoin saw the men inside the store shortly thereafter and became angry. Later that night, Smith and Vaughn drove past Ardoin on the highway, and the chase ensued. At some point, Ardoin began shooting at the pair from behind, striking Smith with a bullet. Vaughn attempted to take control of the wheel, but the vehicle crashed into a tree and caught fire. A bystander helped Vaughn out of the car, but Smith died from his injuries. Police connected Ardoin to the crime using surveillance footage and other evidence, and charged him with first-degree murder and attempted first-degree murder. Number 4. Barry Washington Jr. 22-year-old Barry Washington Jr. was standing outside a nightclub in Bend, Oregon in late 2021 when he spotted a young woman and politely complimented her. She told him that she was flattered, but had a boyfriend. The woman's partner, 27-year-old Ian Cranston, confronted Washington, and tensions quickly escalated from words to violence. After throwing a few punches, the fight stopped, but that wasn't the end of it. Cranston then pulled a gun from his waistband and fatally shot Washington. He was charged with second-degree murder, first and second-degree manslaughter, first-degree assault, and 2 counts of unlawful use of a weapon. Washington was African-American, leading Deschutes County District Attorney John Hummel to suggest that the homicide has overtones of the dark history of black men being murdered for speaking to white women. Hummel failed to find enough evidence to charge the defendant with a bias crime, but said that he believed Washington would not be dead if he were not black. Cranston's attorney argued that his client shot Washington in self-defense after being hit in the face twice. However, the judge overseeing the case denied the defendant's motion for bail and ordered for Cranston to remain behind bars until his trial. Number 3. Ashley MacArthur. 33-year-old police officer Taylor Wright vanished in Pensacola, Florida in 2017. Detectives questioned her best friend, former crime scene technician Ashley MacArthur, after identifying her as the last known person to see Taylor alive. During the first of 2 interviews, MacArthur took a flirtatious and playful tone with investigators. She was much more serious during the second interview, indicating that perhaps she knew that it was only a matter of time before she was held accountable for murdering Taylor. After all, no amount of charm could conceal the obvious evidence pointing toward her involvement, including the discovery that Taylor had given MacArthur $34,000 for safekeeping shortly before she disappeared. Police found Taylor's body buried on property owned by MacArthur's aunt and charged the suspect with first-degree premeditated murder. A jury convicted her of the crime, and she received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. MacArthur maintained her innocence and appealed her case, but a court upheld her conviction. At this point, it's safe to say that she'll never see freedom again, no matter what strategy she tries. Number 2. Bianca Bowmont. 34-year-old Bianca Bowmont was at a booze and drug-fueled party in Newport, Wales in early 2021 when her friend, 32-year-old Carly Tuft, allegedly punched and disfigured her in a jealous rage. Tuft accused Bowmont of flirting with her boyfriend and left her with serious injuries that required medical treatment. When Bowmont tried leaving the apartment to go to the hospital, the boyfriend, John Jackson, threatened to murder her young children if she reported the assault to law enforcement. He told her to say that she had been attacked on the street. Just days later, the couple attended Sunday dinner at Beaumont's mother's house and acted like nothing had happened. However, the attack left Bowmont struggling with both emotional trauma and physical scars, including slash marks on her face. Despite the warning not to snitch, she reported the incident to police, and both Jackson and Tuft were arrested. Jackson told the judge that he threatened Bowmont because he was afraid of his girlfriend and was compelled to go along with the situation. The judge called him a coward and sentenced him to 4 years in prison for making threats to kill. Tuft was convicted of wounding with intent and received a 6.5-year sentence. Number 1. Mac Bond. 58-year-old Mac Bond was a respected 21-year veteran of the Memphis Fire Department. He was off duty one day in 2020 when he allegedly approached a couple who were sitting in a rented car at a public park. They claim that he repeatedly asked them to have intercourse. 25-year-old Carlton Wells, who was in the vehicle with his girlfriend Danielle Mack, fatally shot Bond at the scene. The couple then returned their rental car to the agency, claiming it had transmission problems. It's unclear what was actually said during the confrontation, but that's the story Wells told after he was identified as the suspect in surveillance footage. He admitted to shooting Bond, claiming that the firefighter's repeated come-ons made him feel uncomfortable and scared. Wells was charged with second-degree murder and being a felon in possession of a handgun, and Mac faced a tampering with evidence charge. It's unclear where the case currently stands, but it's unfortunate that Wells resorted to killing Bond rather than simply driving away. If you could take back one thing that a past romantic partner persuaded you to do, what would it be? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.